Richard Bowser.
Good evening. I've just come down from Coventry at the Landlord Show up at the Rico, the Coventry Stadium, and I did a presentation there to a group of landlords, about 80 in the room, and my presentation was an hour and 15 minutes, and I've got to condense that into 5. So, Ranjan sent me an email, and he's asked me three questions to give you some food for thought on, and I had about 10 minutes to prepare. So, it's the economy stupid will be the first thing that we need to think about in terms of challenges in 2017. So what's happening? Fear, uncertainty and doubt has been in the market since the Brexit vote, and yet in the last week or so, 2 things have stood out. Retail sales are up by over 6%, so we've got a strong consumer economy at the moment here in the UK, and the jingle bells are going, etc. And the UK is still the strongest performing economy in the G7. And that's been out there for quite a while. What that says about the other 6, I don't know. Make your own minds up. But if we look out into the wider scene, and I've been up at Coventry, it's a very positive story up at Coventry. It was, a few months ago, the 9th most buoyant property market in the UK. The ripple has occurred, and it's continuing to occur. It started in 2009, when number 1 Piccadilly was the time to be buying number 1 Piccadilly. It's probably not the time to be buying number 1 Piccadilly now, is it? Because of what we know about what's going on in Zone 1, which is a much colder market than it was 3 or 4 years ago when it was incredibly buoyant. So the ripple has occurred, and some of the regional markets are much more buoyant. Where Susie operates down in Bristol has been a very buoyant market for the last 3 or 4 years. Is that the case now? Possibly not, and I'm sure Susie may comment on that later. Specifically, the challenges ahead. Well, I divide those into 2 specific segments. 3 of those relate to what the government's been doing, because it encouraged buy-to-let for near on 20 years, and it's turned its back on buy-to-let in the last year and a half. In fact, 1 year ago today, I was at the same arena at Coventry doing a talk when a text came through from me from a colleague and said, do you know what the Chancellor's just done with stamp duty? 3% on stamp. And of course, you know what that's caused in the market since April in terms of its impact. Certainly, it's impacting much more strongly on the higher value areas, because 3% is an extra transaction upfront cost that you've got to pay, whether you're buying to let or if you're doing a turn, a flip. So the tenant tax, Section 24, is going to impact gradually. It kicks in from April next year over a 4-year period. That will be one of the challenges that you will have to deal with if you've not incorporated or you've not looked to incorporate. You're going to have to look at your tax strategy going ahead over 4 years. The stamp duty, I've already mentioned. The new one, which is really going to affect lending, and Tom may focus on this as well, is the PRA regulations on lending, which are going to start from January. Buy-to-let borrowers will be classed as a professional landlord if they've got 4 properties with mortgages from next September, but also you're going to face much more stringent criteria. So those are in terms of the challenges, and build to rent is obviously the one that's emerging. Professional, institutionally funded, purpose-built rental accommodation, similar to what the student blocks are doing. And we know what the impact has that been in some markets. Strategies is the next thing we need to focus on, and I'm going to do this very, very quickly. Always buy, if you can, and add value, whether you are, whatever you're doing. So it's always looking at buying added value. Yield, because of the PRA changes on lending, yield will be the determinant now. So you should always be focusing on good, solid yield. In terms of most people probably are into residential buy-to-let, but certainly what many of my more experienced subscribers have been doing is much more mixed use and commercial and land and planning development, and I'm sure Paul will give you some insight into that. So those are the sort of 4 strategy points just to think about. Very broad brush, I appreciate. Not low yield vanilla buy-to-let, certainly in and around the high value areas, because there isn't going to be the growth to underpin it. And then finally, the landscape in 3 years' time. Brexit, we don't know what we don't know, and there's a lot we don't know because the government are playing their poker playing poker, so we've just got to see how that plays out. So we've got a lot of unknowns there. Without question, rents will be going up gradually, and in some cases quite sharply, because supply will be constrained. Build to rent will impact on certain markets. And then, of course, we've got the build up to the election in 2020, and that is something that you will need to think about in the next 3 or 4 years, because what tends to happen is, what likely is to happen is that we are going to have a stagnant year next year in many markets in terms of average prices. What happens with the wider economy, we don't know. At the moment, it looks relatively positive. And yeah, so that's something to think about for 3 or 4 years' time. But my underlying message really is, whatever the market throws at us, it is more challenging than it was 2 years ago when we had a bit of a Goldilocks period. Everything was wonderful. Bank rate is incredibly low. That looks set to continue. That's also something you need to take into account. But without question, to professionalize and systemize the business of being a property investor is what I would say is my key takeaway from this. Thank you.